So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's class. Can somebody please close the door? Thank you. So, unfortunately, there is a problem with the technique. I think we can do it also this way. So, last week we introduced the topic of theory of war and peace. And as I explained last week, we're going to face this topic in 3 parts. And the first, which is also the largest one, is devoted to model theoretic analysis of strategic interactions between states in situations of international disputes that may lead to military conflict. So, just to remember what is the motivation for the class. So, war is by far the worst man-made disaster that occurs to humanity, and it is so bad because it entails the systematic and massive killing of large numbers of human beings, and therefore also violence is widespread in the form of rape and torture. The consequence is economic plight and sometimes even starvation. And this even occurred very recently in the Middle East. An aspect that has been underlined only very recently is also the ecological consequences of war. I remember that 2 years ago, The Economist reported about a study that found out that the military operations in the Ukraine, because of the war against Russia, caused as much CO2 emissions in 9 months as 1 year for Bulgaria or Denmark. So military conflicts so entails a lot of damaging CO2 emissions and a lot of other negative effects upon the natural environment. So there are also major moral and cultural effects of wars, hate and desire of vengeance among the survivors on each side, so that there is an intergenerational transmission of hate because the relatives of killed people have a desire to avenge their relatives, and this makes military conflicts last over decades or centuries. Some conflicts, like in Ireland, have been lasting for centuries. So, and as I said before, also last week, the first victim of wars is always truth, and there is a systematic devaluation of truth and scientific rigor and honesty. So there is also an impairment of reason and reputation of truth that is sustained by the media and propaganda. And so what I failed to state here is also the moral impairment, so the fact that another kind of moral seems to apply, so right or wrong, my country, so that people are ready to endorse moral statements that they would never do in their private or domestic or personal life. So we want to try to explain how it comes that we arrive as human beings to such a disaster of collective rationality, such a huge failure. And in the final part, we would also like to arrive at some normative implications. So, how could war be averted or at at least how could we contribute to decrease the likelihood of future wars. So, as I said also last week, it is not going to be a class on international relations or on history, but on theory and since war is, well, let us remember the definition of war. So war is defined as armed conflict between organized political groups. So we have some organized political groups that interact with each other in a potentially destructive way. And of course, every political group involved in this interaction aims at foster its interest, and since it is a situation of conflict, fostering one's interest implies arming the opponent. So it is a strategic interaction, so like a play of chess, or like a situation of oligopolistic firms competing in a market. And that's why game theory is the natural tool in order to study the issues that we mentioned before. Because game theory is the only scientifically founded method that we have in order to understand rational decision making in strategic situations. So we will make use of game theory. Not only game theory, but game theory will be necessary. So of course, knowing a little bit about game theory is necessary but not sufficient in order to understand the reality of war. Okay. So we use game theory as a device in order to organize ideas in a consistent way, because by means of game theory we can only check the logical consistency of our claims. And we use it in order to understand better what went on in the history of war, and also in the history of peace. So, as every theory, also game theory makes use of assumptions that lead to abstract models. So this is, on the one hand, an advantage, because of being abstract, these models can capture a wide range of historical circumstances. The disadvantage is that being abstract, they also fail to capture many elements of historical reality. So the use of game theory, in order to be proficient, should be always accompanied by some historical knowledge. So I presume that you are acquainted with the main historical developments of our times, so that when I speak about the Cold War or the 30 Years' War or some other wars, that you know about those wars sufficiently, but I have not to delve with the various historical examples. So today we are going just to give you the flavor of the use of game theory, which, by the way, I should stress that since I think at least the 80s, especially in the US, all major departments of political science make use of game theory. So there are some economists trained in game theory that have a double appointment, for instance, in Yale, at the economics department, and the Department of Political Science. So that, so in Europe, or in Germany, it is less widespread in political science department, in use of quantitative methods, but in the US, in Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, it is very common and useful. Okay. So, how do we proceed? So we make, in general, three basic assumptions, so that the models that we will deal with during the next couple of weeks share the following features. So the first one is that players in our models will be states. So we are not talking about civil wars, we are talking about international conflicts. So, and we are talking about states as if they were players. So this is of course already a very strong assumption, a strong simplification, because states, so we mean then typically government, these are not individuals. So, well, one could philosophically start a discussion about the reason that we have to assume that individuals can be described as a continuous agent and with the same type of preferences and so on. But for states, it is even more difficult. No? So, of course, there may be changes in the government, for instance, in democracies because of an election during an international conflict, and there may be conflicts within a given government, so that even the decision-making within the government is subject to an issue of collective decision-making. And you know that collective decision-making is problematic. So, you know, our possibilities theorem and the literature on the aggregation of preferences and aggregation of information. Still, this is the best that we can do. So we will abstract from this, and we will also abstract from the fact that in some important historical circumstances, it were not just states that fought a war, but coalitions of states. For instance, in the first years of the last century, the Triple Entente was created, and then the Triple Alliance, and these alliances then led to the First World War. So that in those situations, actually, we should talk about a game between alliances, or even better, a larger game in which there are states which have also the possibility as a strategy to form or to get out of an alliance. So this is an important topic, but we cannot address it today. So, second general restriction is that we assume that states interact in the context of international anarchy. So this means that there is no world government that can enforce international agreements, like, say, the police and the tribunals can do within a given country, between enforcing a private contract, say, contract between individuals. We will talk more about this in 3 weeks, I think. assumption that is not completely verified in reality. So in reality, so not only we have international law, in which we will have the class, and we will have the United Nations. In the past we had the League of Nations, but also before that we used to have international agreements in which, for instance, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire or the Pope would exert some kind of universal authority in order to settle international disputes. So, that is to say, when if two countries clash or think about fighting against each other, they have to take into account what these other international actors will do as a reaction. And this we will abstract from. So I think for many situations this is an acceptable assumption, but of course when in reality you should always think about this. So third, we assume that states behave rationally in a narrow sense, pursuing some objectives that they have and that we do not discuss, at least in the first part of the class. They can be territory, power, security, wealth, and the assumption means, this is the standard assumption game theory, that the game is played by players that have a well-defined preference order over the possible outcomes of the game, and they try to choose actions that are most conducive in order to attain their aims. So we do not discuss if those aims are rational, so whether it is rational to be rational and so on, but we assume that they are rational. I think next week we will also briefly discuss irrationality. Okay. So, are there questions about the general method? So then, today we start by having a look at extremely simple games in normal form, which, however, are sufficiently rich in order to teach us something about very important military conflicts of the past. So, we restrict the attention, as I said before, to states, and in particular to just a couple of states. So 2 states. No? There is a player 1 and player 2. This is one state and the other state. And they have a dispute. And they have in today's lecture only 2 possibilities, which we can interpret in very different ways, but so that we just consider 2 times 2 games, and these games are moreover also symmetric, which simplifies things a lot. So they are static. This does not imply that they are moving simultaneously, really, but when they move, they do not know what the other one has done. So that they can be completely described by this theory of matrix. So if you remember how to read such a matrix, so we have player 1 on the left hand side and player 2 on the top, and then we have the strategies available. And in this simple example, there are just 2 strategies for each one, and we denote them as an A for no attack and A for attack. So in the general case, this will be like no attack, stay peaceful, and attack starts a war. So, and then within the cells, you have the order of the payoffs of the two players. The first number refers to the first player, and the second one to the second one. So, the payoffs, as you know, depict the von Neumann-Morgenstern utility function. That is to say, every affine transformation of these payoffs is allowed for every player. That is to say, you can add a constant and multiply the payoffs by a constant, and nothing changes with respect to equilibrium. So, so the first cell, for instance, would depict the situation in which both states choose to stay peaceful, and we normalize the payoffs of the players to 0 in the case of peace. So, then there is a possibility that the first player attacks while the others does not attack. So, here you may think of attacking and not attacking also as entailing the building of weapons and not building of weapons. So that if state 1 attack, it means that it has prepared for war and it wins the war. Whereas the other state that has not prepared for war will lose. So in this case, the payoff of the winner, of the first state, the winner, is denoted by M minus C, where M is the gross gain from victory, which would be territory or grabbing wealth from the other state, or having more power, or more prestige in the international scene. And then, however, there are the costs of attacking, waging war, and so there will be some casualties also for the winner. So that the net payoff in the case of victory, military victory, is M minus C. So for the other state, there is defeat. And we denote the payoff of defeat by minus D. Okay? So in this cell, we have the reverse situation in which state 1 is attacked by state 2 without having prepared for war, and the payoffs are reversed. Then there is the possibility that both prepare for war and wage war, in which case there is no winner in this model. So there is it's a symmetric dispute, and that's why both have neither the gross gain from victory nor the payoff of defeat, but they just have the cost of war. Okay. So now you see that basically we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different payoff levels. 4 different payoff levels. Now, by changing the order of magnitude, the relative order of magnitude of these payoffs, we can generate 3 typical game structures that can be used in order to interpret reality. And these are the prisoner's dilemma, the stagnant game, and the chicken game. Okay? Okay. So, the prisoner's dilemma arises when we have this relative order, this rank of payoffs. So, in this case, we have the the player, the state, every state, because it is always symmetric. So, every state always prefer to win a war as compared to keep peace. However, it prefers to keep peace rather than wage war and having unentschieden, having no victory, but also no defeat. And it prefers this situation to being defeated. So, if we have this rank order of payoffs, then the matrix becomes like this. So here I will follow the convention to use the Greek letters alpha, beta, gamma, delta in order to condensate notation and to have always the fact, to have always the rank order that alpha is larger than beta, beta is larger than gamma, and gamma is larger than delta. So, if we have this rank of payoffs, then the matrix has this structure. And you know, the Price's dilemma has a Nash equilibrium in dominant strategies, which is to defect. So in this case, it is apparent that defect here is like attacking, where cooperate is like non-attacking. So, Nash equilibrium, this you will know, but so, Nash equilibrium is a situation in which every player chooses her best response given what the other players are doing. It is to say, given that the other players have chosen a certain way, a player has no incentive to change her decision. Okay? It is to say, every state thinks about the strategic situation, put itself in the shoes of the opponent, tries to figure out what the opponent is thinking, and of course realizes that the opponent is doing the same. And they both know that everybody is doing this. And the only situations, only decisions that are rational in such a strategic situation is the Nash equilibrium. So in the case of the Price's dilemma, this is the derivation of the Nash equilibrium is extremely simple. It's extremely simple. Why? Because one strategy, from the viewpoint of every single player, is dominated by the other. That is to say, irrespective of what my opponent is doing, I am always better off defecting. In this case, attacking. So let's check it. So I am player 1 and player 2 is I am player 1 and I consider what is my best strategy if my opponent is going to stay peaceful. If my opponent is going to be peaceful, these are the possibilities. So if I stay peaceful, I get beta, which is 0 in the matrix before. But if I attack, I get alpha, which is m minus 3, which is larger than 0. That is to say, if my opponent stays peaceful, attacking or building weapons is certainly better than staying peaceful. Now, what about the situation in which my opponent is attacking or building weapons? Well, if I stay peaceful and he attacks, well, I'm going to be defeated and will get delta, which is minus d in the previous matrix. But if I also build weapons, I get gamma, which is larger than delta, because minus c is larger than minus d. And that's why also in this case, I would prefer to attack. So that irrespective of what my opponent is doing, for me it is always the best thing to build weapons and attack. So I should point out that, since Egyptian times, governments involved in wars, especially in fires, always had a lot of advisors that discussed war and strategy in a very serious way. And they did not have game theory, so game theory was basically developed during the Second World War. So von Neumann and Morgenstern. So von Neumann was this great mathematician, a Jew of Hungarian origin, and Morgenstern, a very important economist. And indeed, they started to develop the theory of zero-sum games. Zero-sum games are games in which the gain to one player is always equal to the loss of the other player. So this is an extreme form of war. And game theory was used already during the Second World War. And after the Second World War, both superpowers and then all other countries created strategist councils that would advise about international political decisions. So that this type of strategic thinking is usual. So, especially in the US, they created, I think already, I'm not sure, but very soon after the Second World War, they created the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation in Santa Fe, California, and this is a place where game theorists, economists, and experts in military conflict and so on prepare strategies. So it is not far fetched to think that states reason strategically in a very serious way about this issue. They invest a lot of brains in preparing for this. Especially in the Cold War, the investment was huge. So many of the most brilliant scientists were hired by the government in the US and in Soviet Union in order to prepare for a war against other superpower. Okay, so in this situation, the prediction of game theory is very clear, and the prediction is if the conflict has these characteristics, with this type of payoff structure, it will end in war. It could be a Cold War. So, and indeed, the President's dilemma underlies the so-called Orwellian view of the Cold War. George Orwell, the British writer. So, the Cold War. After the end of the Second World War, two superpowers arise and dominate almost the entire rest of the globe. These are the United States of America and the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. So, theories were allied during the war against Nazi fascism. But already during the last period of the war, and especially after the end of the Cold War, of the World War, the relations between the US and the Soviet Union worsened. So there are thousands of volumes that have been written in order to explain why it happened, and there are different theories about it. Fact is that this conflict translated into 45 years of what we call Cold War. Cold War. That is to say, instead of having peaceful relations with each other, these two countries and their allies, this means especially Western Europe and other Western countries for the US, and Eastern Europe and some other allies for Soviet Union, they entered almost half a century of Cold War. And this Cold War entailed, first of all, huge military expenditures. So that's 5%, now we are talking about 5% of GDP going to the military. So 5% was, so to speak, the bottom, the smaller level of military expenditures in the United States or Soviet Union during the Cold War. Very often they spent more than 5%. And then there was the risk of having a hot war instead of a cold one, which could have become the end of mankind, because thermonuclear weapons, this we will discuss in, I think in a month, thermonuclear weapons have very special characteristics that, if employed, would lead to so very soon the extermination of a large part of the humanity, and in the short term or the middle term to create so-called nuclear winter, which means that the entire Earth would basically die. So it was a great risk. So for the Cold War, there have been various interpretations. How did was this Cold War necessary? Why did we arrive to the Cold War? And to simplify things, you can classify the literature in 4 basic interpretations. Both superpowers are bad, both superpowers are good. US are good, USSR are bad. US is bad, USSR is good. So the Orwellian interpretation is both superpowers were truly imperialistic powers that wanted to obtain world hegemony. And that's why, indeed, for each one of them, they valued victory higher than peace. So Cold War was inevitable, because they were greedy. Like Orwell 1984, in which there are always conflicts. And this is the Orwellian interpretation of the Cold War. So both sides were truly greedy and would prefer to have a war and win rather than being peaceful. And since each side feared the other one, they would hated the other one. They would go for the war. So the Priceless Dilemma depicts the Orwellian view of the Cold War. Okay, so now let us come to the other interpretation of the Cold War. That interpretation is actually they were not bad, these two superpowers. Actually, they preferred peace. They preferred peace, but they didn't trust the other side. So they entered Cold War, so to speak, as not by accident, but because of a coordination failure. Nobody could commit to being really peaceful, and in this situation, they entered the Cold War, and they remained stuck in it. This is called the security dilemma. This is something that we will see more in detail also during the next classes. So, the security dilemma comes from, yes?
Just a question to the slide before, because would it be feasible, such a scenario, that there would be a contract between those two states? So without, now in realist view, without a
in the price
third
dilemma.
party. Yeah.
So,
without,
well,
not just there, but also in the real life. So looking back from now, so
yes, I
with
said
without that.
yes. So this is a very good point, and indeed we will deal explicitly on this. This refers to the first or the second general assumption that I stated before: international anarchy. So the idea is, so basically there is no world authority above the superpowers. So that, so maybe I,
of course, because of that, like realism says it's better to have a bipolar system. So
yeah. So remember the Nash equilibrium in the prisoner's dilemma is itself here. Is itself Pareto dominated by this peaceful situation. So I forgot, thank you, I forgot to stress it because so I think you have seen already Price's dilemma many times. But so Price's dilemma is a foundational game in social sciences because it depicts the contradiction between individual and collective rationality. So from the individual viewpoint, it is always better to attack, to defect in the dilemma, so that you arrive at this situation. But in theory, there is also this situation, and both players collectively would prefer to stick to this one. So if these two players are, say, two vassal states of an empire, and there is an emperor with authority over them that can guarantee an agreement, then, well, the emperor can say, well, come to me, and the emperor says, well, you will not build weapons, you will not build weapons, and you will have beta, and if somebody tries to cheat and to build secret armies, I will go to it and I will destitute. But this is not the situation of the superpowers after the World War II. So, in the context of international anarchy, there is no world authority. So there is no contract that can be enforced. Everything that they say is cheap talk. They could say, well, I will, and indeed, the propaganda on both sides were always like this. Actually, we are completely peaceful. Actually, we are only reacting to what the other side has been doing. Okay. So, now what happens if we change a little bit the rank of the players? Now, here you see this is the change I have performed. So now I say actually both prefer peace to being victorious. Why? Because being victorious implies that you have fought the war, and the war has been very costly, with a lot of lives lost, and casualties, and destruction. So this changes the strategic situation. Now, peace, not attack, has the highest payoff, alpha. Then there is the payoff that you get if you win the war, and then there is the situation of when neither winning nor losing, and then there is losing. Okay? So let us analyze this type of strategic interaction. So, given that my opponent is not attacking, what is my best response? So, if I do not attack, we stay in peace. If I attack, I win. But actually, I prefer peace to win because I don't like war. So that if my opponent plays not attack, my best response is not attack. So the reasoning for the other player is symmetric. If player 1 plays not attack, by playing not attack, it gets alpha, which is larger than beta, which is the outcome of playing that. That is to say, not attacking is forming, these are mutual best responses, and therefore form a Nash equilibrium. So, however, what happens if player 1 opts for attack? If player 1 opts for attack, for player 2, well, not attacking leads defeat, which means getting delta. Attacking means at least to stay not defeated, and that leads to gamma, which is larger than delta. That is to say, if player 1 plays attack, the best response of player 2 is attack. And since the game is symmetric, the same holds true with respect to the optimal decision of player 1. Given that player 2 attacks, the optimal response of player 1 is to attack. But then also, both attacking is a Nash equilibrium. That is to say, in such a situation where both prefer peace to war, winning the war, there are two equilibria, two Nash equilibria. Moreover, these two equilibria can be Pareto ranked. What does it mean, Pareto rank? So Pareto rank means that one is a Pareto improvement as compared to the other. That is to say, every agent, every player is better off. And this is the case for the peaceful equilibrium as compared to the war equilibrium. So, and this is an alternative interpretation of the Second World War, of the Cold War after the Second World War. So, some historians say actually neither Stalin nor Truman wanted a world conflict with the other one, but they were scared by the fact that the other may attack. And so they decided to build weapons, to rearm, to have nuclear weapons, and so on. And this was done actually for defensive reasons, but it was at the same time also something that could be used in order to attack the other side, so that the other side also had the same incentive to build weapons to defend itself, but in this way threatening the opponent. And so they came into this Cold War, which led to this suboptimal equilibrium. This is called in the literature the security dilemma. So this we will discuss more in detail in the next weeks. So, according to this interpretation, the superpowers were both good, but were the victim of a coordination failure. They failed to coordinate on the good equilibrium. So, stag hunt comes from, indeed, from this example given by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. There are two men that want to hunt some wild animals, and they decide to go to the hunt, and they want to hunt stag. So a hirsch, I think, in German. And well, if both make efforts jointly, they can manage to get the big prey. However, if only one makes the effort, then this is unsuccessful. So, if the man, instead of the single man, so they go separately into the wild, into the wood in order to get the prey, and so they say at the beginning, well, we will go for the stag, but there is a possibility also to get a hare, so hase, and this can a single man do alone. So, of course, a stag is more worthwhile than two hares, or dividing a stag in two is more work than a hare. And so we have this type of situation in which if they both go for the stag, they can get the big prey, but if the other guy is not going for the stag but for the hare, then the one who is going for the stag is going to come home without anything. But the one who is going for the hare is getting the hare, and so it has got something. So, and this is the same type of coordination equilibrium, so that if you expect the other one to go for the stag, like you, then you go for the stag, and you get a lot of meat. But if you expect that the other one is not going for the stag, then you also cheat and go for the hare, so that at least you have the hare. So, what does economic or game theory say about situations in which we have multiple equilibria? Well, generally, we think that if players can communicate, they will try to focus on the Pareto superior equilibrium. So, however, there is also the concept of risk dominance. So, it is to say, suppose we are in situations in which alpha, beta, gamma, so these three players, are in this rank order, but they are relatively close to each other. Whereas delta minus D, which is being defeated in the Cold War, is very, very negative. Is much, much worse. Then, yes, you can talk a lot with the other superpower and say, Well, don't build secret weapons, don't use biological weapons and so on. But in the end, you cannot check what the other is doing, and the risk that you trust the other, but then the other is going to attack you, then you get minus d, delta, which is very, very bad. And in this case, it is not so far-fetched to think that people in such a situation, although they are rational and can communicate, they will end up here and not here. So there is another interpretation of this model, which is the situation of nuclear warfare, in the case in which there is a so-called first strike advantage. First strike advantage is a very important feature of nuclear war. So if you read the literature on this, you find a lot. It is so important, so much more important than in the past. In the past, there was also the concept that the first strike advantage gives you an advantage because you have the surprise effect on your side. The enemy is surprised, and you can choose also where to start the battle. But in nuclear war, the first strike advantage is much more significant, because in nuclear war you can use especially missiles that fly very rapidly, and by sending many nuclear missiles with nuclear warheads on the missile silos of your enemy, or where there are jets that can carry nuclear bombs with them, you can practically destroy completely the nuclear might of your opponent, and then you win the war. So that is very important. This we will see in nuclear warfare, that there is a balance of terror in order to guarantee that the opponent has